Every guest at a wedding wonders the same thing. Am I strong enough to be here? For Eleanor Vance, the question was not a casual thought. It was a razor's edge she had been walking for 3 months. She stood near the back of the Grand Astoria Ballroom, a place she once dreamed would host her own celebration. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses in expensive perfume, a cloying sweetness that coated her throat. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen tears, dripped light onto the gilded mirrors, reflecting a sea of smiling faces that all looked vaguely familiar and entirely hostile. Her fingers were locked around the stem of a champagne flute. She knew if she let go, if she loosened her grip for even a second, the trembling in her hand would become a tremor that would shatter the illusion of composure she had so carefully constructed. She had told herself this was an act of strength, a way to show Julian, to show Sophia, to show this entire world that they had not broken her. But with every polite nod and every pitying glance she received, the truth settled deeper into her bones. This was not strength. This was self-punishment on a grand scale, a ghost attending the happiest day of the people who had killed her. Her gaze drifted across the room, past the laughing clusters of high society, and landed on the bride, Sophia Hayes, her former best friend. She was radiant, a vision in white lace, her laughter bright and effortless. She looked exactly as they had always planned she would on her wedding day. The only difference was the man standing beside her. Julian Croft, her ex-fiancé, looked like a prince from a storybook. His blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, his smile was a weapon of easy charm, and his hand rested possessively on the small of Sophia's back. He caught Eleanor's eye for a fleeting moment. There was no apology in his gaze, no trace of regret. There was only a flash of arrogant satisfaction, a silent taunt that said, "Look what I have. Look what you lost." Eleanor's heart gave a painful thud, a dull, familiar ache. She had loved him with a sincerity he had treated like a temporary convenience. He had taken her trust, her future, and her closest friend, and woven them into this perfect public spectacle of betrayal. And then she saw it. On Sophia's delicate hand, catching the light from the chandeliers, was the ring. Not just any ring, it was the Vance sapphire, an heirloom passed down from Eleanor's grandmother, a deep blue stone surrounded by a constellation of antique diamonds. Julian had given it to Eleanor on the night he proposed, speaking of tradition, of family, of a future that would last forever. Now it was on Sophia's finger. The sight of it was a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, and the room tilted slightly. She remembered Sophia's words from years ago, admiring the ring on Eleanor's grandmother's hand. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she had whispered, her eyes wide with an envy Eleanor had mistaken for simple admiration. Now that envy was wearing a wedding dress. Eleanor forced herself to breathe. In, out. She focused on the string quartet playing a gentle, forgettable melody. It was the same quartet she and Julian had picked out together. Every detail of this wedding was a ghost of a life she was supposed to have. The floral arrangements, the 5-tier cake she could see in the corner, even the font on the invitations she had received in the mail, a cruel and formal announcement of her own obsolescence. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, even if they were only in her imagination. They were whispering, "That's her," they would say. The poor girl Julian left. Can you believe she actually came? She could feel their pity like a physical touch, a condescending pat on the head that made her skin crawl. She needed to leave. The thought was a desperate prayer. Just turn around, walk out the door, and never look back. But her feet felt rooted to the plush carpet. Leaving now would be an admission of defeat. It would be giving them the satisfaction of knowing they had driven her out. So she stayed. She held her champagne, a bitter, bubbling liquid she had no intention of drinking. She kept the polite, vacant smile plastered on her face, a mask that felt heavier with each passing minute. She was an actress in the final tragic scene of a play she never wanted to be a part of. The clinking of a glass pulled her from her trance. Julian's best man, a smarmy investment banker named Thomas, was tapping a spoon against his flute, calling for attention. A hush fell over the crowd. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She knew what was coming. The speeches, the public declarations of love, the rewriting of history. Thomas began with the usual pleasantries, a few tired jokes about Julian's college days. The crowd laughed politely. Eleanor felt nothing. It was all noise, a meaningless drone against the roaring in her own head. Then Thomas raised his glass. "To the happy couple," he said, "and to Julian, for finally leaving his, let's say, quiet and predictable past behind to find the vibrant, exciting future he deserves with Sophia." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, quiet and predictable past. There was no mistaking the target. It was her. A ripple of muffled laughter, of scandalized titters, spread through the room. It wasn't a roar, but a low, insidious hiss, the sound of sharks sensing blood in the water. People shifted in their seats, their eyes darting towards Eleanor, hungry for a reaction. Her face burned. The smile on her lips felt like it was cracking. It was a direct hit, a public execution of her character, and it had been delivered with a smile. She looked at Julian. He was laughing, his head thrown back, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He was proud of the cruelty. He was reveling in it. Sophia was smiling too, a tight, polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She placed a hand on Julian's arm, a perfect portrait of a supportive new wife, a silent co-conspirator in Eleanor's humiliation. In that moment, Eleanor saw their partnership for what it truly was. It was not a grand romance that had swept them away. It was a cold, calculated merger of ambition and vanity. They deserved each other. Then Julian took the microphone from Thomas. The crowd quieted again, eager for more. "Thank you, Thomas," he began, his voice smooth as velvet. "He's right, you know." He paused, letting the anticipation build. His eyes scanned the room, and for a heart-stopping second, they locked with Eleanor's again. This time there was a glint of pure malice. "My life before Sophia," he continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "was like a perfectly nice, well-made black and white film. It was tasteful. It was quiet. It followed all the rules." He looked over at Sophia, his expression softening into one of adoration. And then Sophia came along, and suddenly my world was in breathtaking color. It was loud and exciting and full of life. She didn't just change my life. She made me realize I hadn't really been living at all. The room erupted in a chorus of awes and applause. It was a beautiful sentiment. It's a poetically crafted declaration of love. But to Eleanor it was a dagger, twisted slowly and deliberately in an open wound. He had taken their shared history, their quiet moments, their private jokes, their plans for a stable, loving life, and he had publicly branded them as dull, as lifeless, as a prison from which Sophia had mercifully rescued him. The foundation of the life they had built together was not just broken, it was being publicly mocked and dismantled, brick by painful brick. That was it. The final thread of her composure snapped. The room was closing in, the scent of roses suddenly suffocating. The smiling faces blurred into a grotesque gallery of judgment. She could no longer breathe the same air as these people. The champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on the floor. No one seemed to notice over the sound of the applause for Julian's perfect speech. Eleanor turned, her movements stiff and robotic. She walked towards the grand double doors, her eyes fixed on the promise of escape. She didn't run. She walked with a rigid dignity she did not feel, each step an immense effort of will. She could feel Julian's eyes on her back. She knew he was watching her leave, and she knew he was enjoying it. This was his final victory, proving to everyone that she was the weak one, the one who couldn't handle it. The thought fueled her steps, pushing her forward through the opulent lobby, past the concierge desk, towards the main entrance of the hotel. The polite hum of the ballroom faded behind her, replaced by the frantic pounding of her own heart. Once she was out of sight of the ballroom doors, her control crumbled completely. A sob broke from her throat, raw and ragged. The tears she had been holding back for hours began to stream down her face, hot and shameful. They blurred the marble floors and the ornate fixtures into a watery mess. She wasn't just crying for the loss of Julian or the betrayal of Sophia. She was crying for her own foolishness, for believing in a promise that was always a lie. She was crying from the deep, burning humiliation of being discarded and then mocked for the crime of having loved him. Her vision was a watery haze. All she wanted was the cold night air, a moment of anonymity in the darkness. She pushed blindly at the heavy glass doors of the main entrance. They swung open and she stumbled out into the relative quiet of the hotel's covered entryway. She didn't see the sleek black car idling silently by the curb. She didn't see the man who had just stepped out of it. She saw nothing but the swirling vortex of her own pain. She took 1, 2, 3 desperate steps, and then she collided with something solid. It was like hitting a wall. The impact jarred her entire body, knocking the breath from her lungs and sending her stumbling backward. Her heel caught on the slick pavement, and her world tipped sideways. She fell, hard, onto the cold stone ground. The shock of the fall momentarily silenced her sobs. For a moment, she just lay there, a crumpled heap of silk and misery, the rough ground scraping against her palms. Her head swam. The entire world seemed to have condensed into this single, mortifying point of impact. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her dress was probably ruined. Her hair had fallen from its elegant arrangement. Her face was a mess of tears and smudged makeup. She felt stripped bare, exposed in the most pathetic way imaginable. She looked up, ready to stammer an apology, ready to face the annoyance or concern of whoever she had run into. But the words died in her throat. A man stood over her. He wasn't looking at her with pity or irritation. He was just looking. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light. His presence was one of absolute stillness, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside her. His face was sharp, handsome in a way that was almost dangerous, with a faint, pale scar cutting through one of his dark eyebrows. He made no move to help her up. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Eleanor's breath caught. She felt pinned by his gaze, as if he could see straight through the shattered facade and into the raw, wounded core of her. The world around them seemed to fade away. The distant sounds of city traffic, the polite murmur from the hotel behind them, all of it receded until there was only the cold ground beneath her and the intensity of his stare. She looked up from the ground into the calm, intense gray eyes of a dangerously handsome stranger, Damien Costello. The cold marble floor was the first thing Eleanor felt. It was a solid, unforgiving reality against her cheek. For a moment, the world was a smear of light and a distant, mocking echo of violins. The scent of lilies and champagne still clung to the air, a cruel reminder of the celebration she had just fled. Her breath came in ragged, hiccuping sobs that felt torn from her chest. Humiliation was a physical weight, pressing her down, pinning her to the ground where she had fallen. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She wanted to disappear before anyone else could see the wreck she had become. Then, a shadow fell over her. It blocked the blinding glare of the lobby chandelier. A pair of expensive, impeccably polished black leather shoes entered her blurry field of vision. They stopped just inches from her collapsed form. She braced herself for a gasp, for a whispered comment, for the familiar sting of pity or scorn. But there was only silence, a deep, unnerving quiet that seemed to absorb the chaos around them. Slowly a hand entered her view. It was a man's hand, large and steady, with clean, short nails. There was no hesitation in the gesture. It simply offered, palm up, a silent command to rise. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't look up. She couldn't face another pair of eyes filled with what she had just seen in hundreds of others. The feigned sympathy, the hidden amusement, the relief that it was her life, not theirs, that had just shattered on a ballroom floor. But the hand did not retract. It remained there, a patient, unmoving anchor in her swirling vortex of shame. Finally, with a shudder that ran through her entire body, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly gentle. He did not yank her up. He simply provided a solid point of leverage, allowing her to find her own footing. As she stood, swaying slightly, she kept her head bowed, her curtain of auburn hair hiding her tear-streaked face. She fumbled with the delicate fabric of her dress, trying to smooth out wrinkles that were the least of her problems. He released her hand, and for a terrifying second she felt utterly alone again. Then something soft was pressed into her palm. She looked down. It was a handkerchief. Not paper, but dark silk, folded into a perfect square. It felt impossibly smooth against her damp skin. She didn't look up as she took it, pressing the cool fabric to her eyes, trying to blot away the evidence of her breakdown. The silk smelled faintly of clean linen and something else, something subtle and masculine like cedar and leather. It was a scent of quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the cloying sweetness of Julian's expensive colognes. She expected him to say something, to ask if she was all right, to make some polite, awkward comment, and then hurry away. But the silence stretched on. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was watchful. It was deliberate. He was giving her a moment to compose herself, an act of grace so unexpected it almost made her cry again. With a final, shaky breath, she lowered the handkerchief and forced herself to look up. He was taller than she had realized. His suit was dark charcoal, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of him. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, a piercing gray that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed walls, directly into the screaming mess inside. A faint white scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only imperfection in a face that was otherwise dangerously handsome. There was no pity in his gaze. There was no judgment. There was only an unnerving, absolute calm. "Eleanor Vance," he said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone. It was not a question. The sound of her own name, spoken with such certainty by this complete stranger, sent a jolt through her. It was as if he had reached into her mind and plucked her identity from the chaos. She flinched, taking a half step back. How did he know her name? Who was this man? Her mind raced, sifting through the faces of Julian's business associates, of family friends, of the city's elite. He was not among them. He was something else entirely. She was certain she would have remembered a presence like this. "You should not be here," he continued, his gray eyes glancing briefly toward the ballroom doors from which the muffled sound of applause now spilled. A new speech, perhaps. Or maybe they were toasting the happy couple again. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. "This place is no longer for you." His words were simple, direct, and devastatingly true. He was not telling her anything she did not already know, but hearing it stated so plainly by a stranger felt like a final verdict. He took a small step to the side, gesturing toward the main glass doors of the hotel entrance. "Allow me to take you home." It was not a request. It was a statement of intent. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to run. Her mother's warnings about strange men echoed in her head from a childhood that felt a million years away. But where would she run? Back into that ballroom, to face the whispers and the stares, out into the street to hail a cab, a weeping, broken woman in a designer gown? The thought was unbearable. This man, with his unnerving calm and his strange knowledge of her, was offering an escape, a quiet, dignified exit from the worst night of her life. She looked at him again, searching his face for any sign of a hidden motive, any hint of danger. She found nothing but an unnerving stillness. He seemed to be a man who was completely in control of himself and his surroundings. "How do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice raspy and thin. It was barely a whisper. A small ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, but it did not reach his eyes. "This is a small city for those who pay attention," he said simply. "And what happened in there," he nodded again toward the ballroom, "was very loud." The implication was clear. He knew everything. He knew about Julian. He knew about Sophia. He knew about the public humiliation she had just endured. And yet, he stood before her without a trace of the gloating pity she so dreaded. He was simply stating a fact. Without another word, she gave a single tight nod. It was a surrender. She didn't have the strength to fight or even to question him further. Following him felt like the only logical step in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. He walked just ahead of her, his broad shoulders creating a shield between her and the prying eyes of the hotel doorman and the valets. No one approached them. No one spoke. As he walked, people seemed to melt out of his path, their gazes dropping to the floor. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible display of power. A silent black sedan pulled up to the curb as if summoned by thought alone. The valet nearly stumbled over himself to open the rear passenger door, his eyes fixed on the ground. Damien waited for her to get in before circling around to the other side. The car door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sealing them in a cocoon of silence and dark leather. The sounds of the city, the distant music from the hotel, all of it vanished. Inside, the car was immaculate, smelling of nothing but clean leather. There was no clutter, no personal effects. It was as sparse and controlled as the man sitting beside her. He gave her address to the driver in a low voice, an address she had not yet spoken. Of course he knew. The realization sent another tremor of fear through her, but it was muted now, overshadowed by a strange sense of resignation. As the car pulled away from the curb, the grand, brightly lit entrance of the Astoria Hotel slid past the window. Her old life was in there, laughing and drinking champagne, celebrating her replacement. Julian's handsome, treacherous face flashed in her mind, his smooth voice, dripping with false sincerity as he toasted his bride. And Sophia, her best friend, the woman who had held her hand and helped her pick out a wedding dress for a wedding that was meant to be hers. She could see Sophia's triumphant smile, the way she had touched the Vance sapphire ring on her finger. The heirloom from Eleanor's own grandmother, now a spoil of war worn by the victor. A sob caught in her throat, and she pressed the silk handkerchief to her mouth to stifle it. The man beside her did not move. He did not speak. He just stared straight ahead, his profile a sharp, powerful silhouette against the blur of passing city lights. She risked a glance at him. He seemed utterly at ease in the silence, while for Eleanor it was a canvas on which her mind painted every agonizing detail of her betrayal. She remembered whispered phone calls she had ignored, late nights Julian had claimed were for work, the way Sophia had started avoiding her gaze weeks before the end. The signs had all been there, a constellation of small betrayals she had been too trusting, too blind to see. Now they burned behind her eyes, each one a separate, specific torment. "He never deserved you," the man said, his voice cutting through her dark thoughts. He was still looking forward, his tone flat, conversational. Neither of them did. The weak always prey on the strong. They mistake kindness for fragility. Eleanor turned to look at him fully. He wasn't offering empty platitudes. He was delivering an analysis, a cold, hard assessment of the situation. It was so different from the tearful reassurances her mother had offered over the phone, the platitudes about time healing all wounds. This man wasn't talking about healing. He was talking about weakness and strength. "You don't know anything about them," she said, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "I know they're kind," he replied, finally turning his head to meet her gaze. His gray eyes were like polished steel in the dim light of the car. "Men who build their fortunes on the names of their fathers. Women who attach themselves to power because they have none of their own. They are parasites dressed in fine clothes, predictable and easily broken." The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, was chilling. He spoke of breaking people as one might speak of breaking a contract. The car slowed, pulling to a stop in front of her modest but elegant apartment building. For a moment, neither of them moved. The engine hummed quietly, a low thrum in the silent street. Her building, which had once felt like a sanctuary, a cozy haven, now seemed small and lonely, a cage where she was expected to lick her wounds in private. She should thank him. She should get out of the car and never see him again. It was the safe, sensible thing to do, but his words echoed in her mind, easily broken. She reached for the door handle, her hand hesitating. "Thank you for the ride," she murmured, her voice still thick with unshed tears. She didn't know what else to say. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a small, black card. It was made of thick, heavy stock. He held it out to her. "My name is Damien Costello," he said. The name meant nothing to her, yet it felt heavy, significant. She took the card, her fingers brushing against his. A strange warmth, a flicker of electricity, passed between them. It was startling. She looked down at the card. It was starkly simple. His name was printed in clean silver letters. Beneath it, just a phone number. No title, no company, no address. It was the card of a man who needed no introduction. "What is this for?" she asked, her gaze lifting back to his. His eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw something flicker in their depths. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, something that looked almost like an opportunity. "You have a choice, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming more intimate in the confines of the car. "You can go up to your apartment. You can cry in there. You can mourn the life you thought you had. You can allow them to win. You can let this be the defining moment of your life." Every word was a small, sharp cut. He was laying her future out before her, the bleak, pathetic future she had been envisioning for herself, a future where she was forever the poor, jilted fiancé. Or, he paused, letting the word hang in the air between them, "You can decide you have cried enough, and you can choose to do something else." Something else. The phrase was vague, but it was loaded with a dangerous promise. It was an alternative to the endless, gray landscape of her grief. It was a door opening into a dark room, and she had no idea what was inside. But it was a door. He leaned back, his point made. "When you make that decision," he said, his voice returning to its cool, even tone, "call me." With that, he gave a slight nod to his driver. The lock on her door clicked open. The message was clear. Her time was up. Numbly, Eleanor opened the door and stepped out onto the cold pavement. The night air felt sharp against her hot cheeks. She didn't look back as she closed the car door. She heard it click shut, and then the quiet whoosh of the sedan pulling away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing around the corner, leaving her in silence and shadows. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the cool night breeze doing little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She walked into her building like a sleepwalker, the polite nod from the night doorman barely registering. The elevator ride up felt impossibly slow. When she finally reached her apartment, she fumbled with the keys, her hands still shaking. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and silent. It was filled with ghosts. The armchair where Julian used to read the paper. The kitchen where she and Sophia had drunk wine and laughed, sharing secrets she now realized were all hers. A framed photograph on the mantelpiece showed the two of them, arms linked, smiling into the camera on a sunny afternoon. A perfect picture of a perfect friendship. A perfect lie. Eleanor leaned her back against the door, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, just as she had been at the hotel. Her expensive dress pulled around her. The silk handkerchief was still clutched in one hand, Damien Costello's card in the other. The weight of the small, black rectangle felt immense. It was a tangible object from a surreal encounter, proof that the man in the dark car had been real. She stared at the name, Damien Costello, and the string of numbers beneath it. Her mind was a war zone. One part of her screamed to tear it up, to throw it away, to lock the door and hide from the world, and from dangerous men who spoke of breaking people. It was the voice of fear, the voice of the woman she had been just a few hours ago. But another voice, a smaller, colder voice she had never heard before, whispered from a deep, wounded place inside her. Something else. The words were a spark in the darkness, an offer not of comfort, but of action, a path that did not lead back to pity and heartbreak, but toward an unknown destination. What did it mean? What would he want in return? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath the fear, something new was flickering to life. It was a tiny, fragile flame, but it was there. It was a flicker of rage. It was a flicker of defiance. It was a flicker of something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm of terror and temptation, as she sat alone in the echoing silence of her ruined life, staring at the choice she now held in her hand. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, and the silence of her apartment was a physical blow. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that swallowed the echoes of the wedding, the polite laughter, the clinking glasses, and the ghost of Julian's cruel words. Eleanor leaned back against the door, her breath catching in her throat, a dry, ragged sound. Her fingers were still clenched around the small, stiff rectangle of cardstock Damien Costello had given her. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a small black anchor in a sea of white noise and shimmering, unshed tears. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, was now a mausoleum. Every object held a memory, and every memory was now tainted, poisoned by the truth she had been forced to see. She walked into the living room, her expensive heels sinking into the plush gray rug. Her own reflection stared back from the dark surface of the television, a pale, haunted figure in a dress that suddenly felt like a costume for a play that had ended tragically. The air was stale, smelling faintly of the perfume she had sprayed on hours ago, a scent chosen for a celebration that became a funeral. She let her eyes drift across the room, the cashmere throw blanket folded neatly over the arm of the sofa. Sophia had helped her pick it out. "Oh, Ellie, this one," she had said, her voice bright and certain. "It brings out the cool tones in the room. It's sophisticated." Eleanor remembered feeling grateful for her friend's decisive taste. Now the memory curdled. Sophia had not been decorating a friend's home. She had been curating a backdrop, a stage set for a life she was already planning to steal. The blanket was not for Eleanor's comfort. It was for Sophia's eventual aesthetic. Her gaze fell on the polished mahogany bar cart in the corner. A bottle of vintage scotch sat there unopened. Julian had bought it 2 months ago. For a special occasion, he'd announced, placing it with a flourish. When we closed the Henderson deal, he had been so confident, so charmingly arrogant. Eleanor had believed him. She had imagined them pouring 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the light, their future stretching out before them, golden and secure. The Henderson deal had closed last week. Julian had celebrated, just not with her. He had celebrated with his new fiancée, Sophia. The bottle was a monument to a future that had never been hers. A wave of nausea washed over her. She stumbled towards the kitchen, her hand pressed to her mouth. She needed water. She needed to wash the taste of champagne and betrayal from her tongue. As she filled a glass from the tap, her mind replayed the lies, each one a small, sharp blade twisting in her memory. She remembered a lunch with Sophia 3 months ago, just weeks after Julian had secretly started the affair. Eleanor had been worried, sensing a new distance in him. She confided in Sophia, her voice trembling. "He just seems distracted, like he's somewhere else." Sophia had taken her hand across the table, her expression a perfect mask of concern. "Ellie, you're overthinking it," she had soothed. "Men like Julian, they get consumed by work. It's what makes them successful. Don't let your insecurities push him away." She had squeezed Eleanor's hand. "You have to trust him." Trust him. The words echoed in the silent kitchen. Sophia had not been offering comfort. She had been actively running interference, calming the prey so the predator could continue his hunt undisturbed. She had used Eleanor's own fears against her, labeling her valid intuition as insecurity. She had been protecting her affair with Julian, not her friendship with Eleanor. The cold water in her glass did nothing to cool the fire of shame and rage building in her chest. How could she have been so blind? How could she have mistaken the glitter of a snake's scales for the shine of a jewel? She walked through the hallway, her bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. She had kicked off her heels somewhere. She didn't remember where. Her movements were aimless, adrift in a home that was no longer hers. Her fingers brushed against the light switch to the spare bedroom, which she had been slowly turning into a home office. On the wall was a corkboard filled with fabric swatches and paint samples for their future home, the one Julian had promised they would build together. He had looked at her plans, a condescending smile playing on his lips. A library with a fireplace? That's very quaint, Ellie. He had tossed the sketches back onto the table. We need something with more impact. A statement. Think glass and steel, not old books. At the time she had felt small, her dreams dismissed as childish. She had told herself he was just more practical, more ambitious. Now she understood. He was not dismissing her taste. He was dismissing her. She was a placeholder, a comfortable and suitable fiancée until the real prize, the Croft-Hayes merger of fortunes, could be arranged with Sophia. Her dreams were irrelevant because she was never meant to be a permanent part of the picture. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her sternum. It was not just the heartbreak of a lost love. It was the shattering humiliation of realizing her entire life for the past 2 years had been a carefully constructed lie. She was not a partner who had been betrayed. She was a fool who had been played. The whole city had watched her play the part tonight, the tragic, discarded woman. They had pitied her. Julian had mocked her, and Sophia had worn her grandmother's ring. That was the thought that finally broke her. The Vance sapphire, a family heirloom, a ring that had been on her grandmother's hand for 60 years, a symbol of enduring love and legacy. Julian had proposed with it, and tonight it had been on Sophia's finger, flashing under the ballroom lights as she waved to the crowd, accepting congratulations for stealing a life that was never hers to take. The ring was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a piece of Eleanor's history, her family, her soul, and Sophia wore it like a trophy. A guttural sob escaped her lips, raw and animalistic. It was a sound of pure agony. Her eyes, blurred with tears, landed on a silver frame sitting on a small table by the window. It was a picture of her and Sophia, taken last summer on a trip to the coast. They were laughing, their heads close together, the sun glinting in their hair. Eleanor's arm was around Sophia's shoulders, a gesture of easy, unquestioning affection. Sophia's smile was wide, dazzling. But now Eleanor saw it for what it was. It wasn't the smile of a friend. It was the predatory grin of a rival who knew she was already winning. Julian had taken that photo. Sophia wasn't smiling for the camera. She was smiling for him. The fragile dam of her control broke. All the pain, the humiliation, the grief coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. Her hands shot out, her fingers closing around the cold, smooth silver of the frame. It was heavier than she expected. For a second, she just held it, her knuckles white, her own face in the photo a stranger's, a naive ghost from another lifetime. She saw the girl who believed in lifelong friendships, the girl who believed in true love, the girl who believed in Julian Croft and Sophia Hayes. She hated that girl. With a scream that tore from the very depths of her being, she hurled the frame across the room. It flew through the air in a silent, perfect arc before it met the opposite wall with a sickening crash. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the apartment's oppressive silence. It was loud. It was violent. It was final. The frame clattered to the floor. Shards of glass, like frozen tears, lay scattered across the dark wood, glittering in the low light from the window. In the center of the wreckage, the photograph lay torn. Sophia's face was ripped in half. And across the floor, a sliver of glass held a distorted, fractured piece of Eleanor's own reflection. One eye, wild and wild, a fragment of a cheek, wet with tears, a mouth parted in a silent gasp. She stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling. The silence that returned was different now. It was not an empty. It was charged, electric. The violent act had not fixed anything, but it had changed something inside her. The tears had stopped. The trembling in her limbs had ceased. A strange calm washed over her, cold and clear. It was the calm that follows a storm, when the air is clean and the world is sharp and new. She looked down at her hand. A thin line of red was welling up across her palm where the edge of the frame had cut her. The small, sharp sting of it grounded her, pulling her out of the fog of memory and pain. She watched the single drop of blood form, dark and vivid against her pale skin. It did not frighten her. It felt right, a small price for breaking the spell. She was done crying. The words echoed in her mind, not in her own voice, but in a deep, calm baritone, a voice that had cut through the noise and chaos of the hotel entrance. When you decide you've cried enough and want to do something else, call me. Damien Costello, the man with the piercing gray eyes and the quiet, unnerving presence. He had not offered pity. He had not offered condolences. He had offered an alternative, an action, something else. Her gaze swept the room, landing on the small black card lying on the living room rug where she must have dropped it. It looked out of place, a piece of the night's darkness that had followed her home. Her movements were deliberate now. She walked over and bent down, her fingers closing around the thick, expensive paper. There was no company name, no title, just a name, Damien Costello, and a number. It was simple, direct, and incredibly powerful. It was the card of a man who did not need to advertise what he did. Everyone already knew. He was a phantom in the city's high society, a name spoken in hushed tones at the very parties Julian and his family frequented. A man who operated by a different set of rules. A man who despised the world that had just tried to destroy her. She stood there, the card in her bleeding hand. The choice was clear. She could stay here, in this museum of lies, and let the grief consume her. She could become the pitiful woman Julian had painted her as, a ghost haunting the edges of his triumphant new life. She could let them win, or she could do something else. A cold resolve settled deep in her bones. It was a terrifying feeling, this new hardness. It felt foreign, like putting on a coat made of iron. But it was also empowering. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. Rage was, a cold, quiet, focused rage. They had taken her past and ruined her present. She would not let them have her future, too. With a steady hand, she walked to her phone, which lay discarded on the kitchen counter. She did not hesitate. Her fingers, stained with a smear of her own blood, tapped the numbers from the card onto the screen. She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. There was no ringing. There was no automated greeting. There was only a single silent click. And then, a voice. It was exactly as she remembered it, deep, calm, and carrying an unnerving weight of authority. It was the voice of a man who was used to being listened to, a man who was never surprised. I was wondering when you'd call. The line went dead, but the echo of his voice remained. It was a low hum in the silent apartment, a vibration that seemed to have settled deep in Eleanor's bones. I was wondering when you'd call. The words were not a question, but a statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of an inevitable event he had already foreseen. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own making. He gave her an address, a street she recognized as one of the city's most exclusive in a time. 1 hour. There was no room for negotiation. There was no need for it. She had made her choice the moment she dialed his number. Eleanor stood under the shower, letting the hot water sluice over her skin, hoping it could wash away the last 3 days. The humiliation, the endless loop of memories, the phantom ache in her chest. It did not work. The water only seemed to make her more aware of her own skin, of the body that had been so easily discarded. She chose a simple black dress, one that was elegant but severe. There would be no more soft pastels, no more hopeful florals. Those belonged to a woman who no longer existed. As she applied a dark red lipstick, her hand was surprisingly steady. She met her own gaze in the mirror. Her hazel eyes looked darker, shadowed with a resolve she had not possessed a week ago. This was not a plea for help. It was a job interview. The taxi ride was a blur of city lights smearing past the window. She felt strangely detached, as if watching a character in a movie take these fateful steps. The building he had named was a spear of dark glass and steel that pierced the night sky. It was aggressively modern, a monument to a new kind of power, so different from the old-world grandeur of the Astoria. There was no grand lobby, only a discreet entrance and a silent doorman who simply nodded as she approached, as if he too had been expecting her. He led her to a private elevator, the doors sliding shut with a quiet, expensive hiss. There was only one button: penthouse. As the elevator ascended, a strange pressure built in her ears. She felt as if she were rising to a different plane of existence, leaving her old life far below on the glittering streets. The doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into a vast living space. Her first impression was one of space and silence. The apartment was immense, a world of cool, dark surfaces, polished concrete floors, walls of glass, and furniture that was stark and beautiful. It was the complete opposite of the cluttered, gilded cage she had almost married into. There were no frivolous decorations, no family portraits smiling down from the walls. There was only the city, spread out before them on all sides through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a breathtaking, predatory view. The city was not a backdrop. It was a kingdom laid at his feet. Damien Costello stood by the window, a silhouette against the endless grid of lights. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, and he turned as the elevator doors whispered shut behind her. He wore a dark gray sweater and black trousers, a departure from the perfect suit he'd worn before. The casual attire did not make him any less intimidating. If anything, it made him seem more dangerous, as if his power was not something he needed to dress up for. It was simply part of him. He did not smile. He just watched her, his gray eyes taking in her black dress, her steady hands, her determined expression. "Eleanor," he said, Her name sounded different in this room, heavier. Thank you for coming. You knew I would, she replied, her voice a little tight. It was the first thing she had said, and it came out as an accusation. A faint hint of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Hope is a powerful motivator. So is the alternative. He gestured towards a long black leather sofa. Please, have a seat. Can I get you something to drink? Water is fine. She needed to keep her head clear. She felt as though she were walking a tightrope over a canyon, and any misstep would send her plunging into an unknown darkness. He moved to a minimalist bar carved into one wall, his movements economical and precise. He poured her a glass of water and returned with his own drink, a whiskey she could smell from across the room, rich with peat and smoke. He did not sit on the sofa with her, but took a low armchair opposite, creating a deliberate space between them. It was a space for business, not comfort. For a long moment, he just looked at her, sipping his drink. The silence was not awkward. It was analytical. She felt like a puzzle he was slowly solving, and she resisted the urge to fidget. She forced herself to hold his gaze, to project an ounce of the same calm he radiated so effortlessly. She was here for a reason, and she would not be unnerved before she even began. Finally, he spoke. You want to know why I'm interested in you, he stated, not asking. You want to know what this is all about. Eleanor gave a single sharp nod. I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Costello, or in selfless acts of charity. Good, he said, his voice a low rumble. Neither do I, and please call me Damien. He leaned forward slightly, placing his glass on the dark wood table between them. I despise men like Julian Croft and his father. They operate under a veneer of respectability. They attend galas, they sit on charity boards, and they call themselves pillars of the community. But their world is built on a different kind of crime. It's quiet, it's insidious, and it's protected by expensive lawyers and social connections. They ruin people with contracts and clauses, not with weapons, but the result is the same. Lives are destroyed. His eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something personal, a coal fire deep within them. He was not just talking about Julian. He was talking about a whole class of people, a system he clearly held in contempt. They believe they are untouchable, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. They believe the rules don't apply to them. They take what they want, they discard who they want, and they face no consequences. They humiliate a woman like you in a room full of their peers, and they are rewarded with applause. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had seen it. He understood the poisoned core of her humiliation, the public spectacle of it all. He understood that it wasn't just Julian's betrayal, but the complicit laughter of an entire room that had shattered her. What you experienced, Damien said, was not just a personal heartbreak. It was a display of power, a statement that they could do anything and you were nothing. You were an object to be set aside when a newer model became available. Tears pricked at the back of Eleanor's eyes, hot and sharp, but she fought them down. She would not cry in front of this man. She would not cry ever again over Julian Croft. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice raw. I want to offer you a partnership, he said simply. I have the resources, the investigators, the financial analysts, the technical experts, people who can find cracks in any corporate facade. We can take apart Julian Croft's life, not just his marriage, but the entire foundation it's built on. His company, his father's reputation, his social standing. We will not just break it, we will dismantle it, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but dust and regret. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was more than she had ever imagined. In her darkest moments, she had dreamed of Julian feeling a fraction of her pain. But this was something else entirely. This was annihilation. The sheer scale of it was terrifying and exhilarating and all at once. The thought of Julian's smug smile wiped away, of Sophia's triumphant glitter turning to ash. It was a seductive, dangerous poison. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do this for me? What do you gain from Julian Croft's ruin? Let's just say I have a professional interest in disrupting the established order, Damien said, his expression unreadable. Julian's company is a rival to certain interests of my own. His downfall would be advantageous. But to do it cleanly, I need a different kind of weapon. I need insight. I need you. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning her face. I can get financial records, phone logs, emails. What I can't get is an understanding of the culture. You spent years inside that world, Eleanor. You know the people. You know their vanities, their fears, their secret loyalties. You went to school with them. You vacationed with them. You know who envies whom. You know which board member has a gambling problem or which executive is having an affair with his assistant. That is the information my people can't find in a database. It's the human element. The very thing they used against you is the key to their undoing. He was right. She had never thought of it that way. All those years of polite smiles, of listening to gossip at charity lunches, of remembering birthdays and anniversaries. She had seen it as social maintenance. He saw it as a map of vulnerabilities, an arsenal. A cold wave of clarity washed over her. She saw Julian, not as the man she had loved, but as a structure, a building full of weak points. She saw Sophia not as her friend, but as a collection of insecurities waiting to be exploited. So I provide you with information, Eleanor said, her mind racing. I become your guide through the swamp. Exactly, Damien confirmed. But this is not a one-way street. As I said, this is a partnership. And in a partnership, both parties contribute value. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the air. I am in the process of acquiring a new company, a clean one, a boutique investment firm. It needs a public face, someone with an impeccable background, who is intelligent, articulate, and moves comfortably in the circles I want this firm to penetrate. Someone, say, who looks the part. Eleanor stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. You want me to be that face? I do, he said. You will be given a significant stake in the company. You will be its vice president. You will attend the meetings. You will network at the events. You will be seen as a rising star in the financial world. A woman who, after a devastating personal setback, pulled herself up and built something of her own. The irony was staggering. He was offering her the very life Sophia had stolen, but this time it would be real. It would be hers, earned through her own intelligence and nerve, not borrowed from a man. She would re-enter their world, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a power player. She would have a legitimate reason to be in the same rooms as them, to look them in the eye, not with hatred, but with the cool indifference of a superior. They will see you, Damien said, his voice soft but intense. And they will have to smile. They will have to shake your hand. And all the while, you and I will be pulling the threads of their comfortable lives until the entire tapestry unravels. Her heart was pounding, a slow, heavy drumbeat of fear and fierce, unholy joy. This was a deal with the devil. She knew that. Damien Costello was a man who lived in the shadows, a man whose reputation was built on fear and control. To align herself with him was to step out of the light forever. But the light had only ever burned her. The world of law and order, of politeness and respectability, had offered her no justice. It had only offered her a stage for her own humiliation. She thought of the Vance sapphire ring on Sophia's finger, a family heirloom, a symbol of love and promise, now a mark of her greatest shame. She thought of Julian's condescending words echoing through the ballroom, the sound of polite laughter that had been like knives in her ears. She thought of the mushbone, empty nights in her apartment, feeling small and powerless and utterly alone. Damien was offering her a way to reclaim her own story, to become the author of her own fate, instead of a footnote in someone else's. The price was high. She would be tied to him, to his world. But what was the alternative? A lifetime of being poor Eleanor, the woman who was publicly jilted at the altar of high society? A lifetime of looking over her shoulder, of avoiding certain restaurants and parties? She refused. She looked across the space that separated them at this calm, dangerous man who saw her not as a broken doll, but as a weapon. He was not offering her pity. He was offering her a sword. He was offering her control. In his world of brutal truths, there was a strange kind of honor. You knew exactly where you stood. It was a far cry from the smiling lies of her past. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor stood up. She walked a few steps to the table and extended her hand. I accept your proposition, Damien. He rose to his feet, his height casting a shadow over her. He did not look surprised. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers, looking for any last trace of doubt. He found none. He took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly steady. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was the sealing of a contract, a binding of two worlds. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of pure, unadulterated power. Eleanor looked at Damien, seeing not a criminal but a path to justice, and shakes his hand, sealing their pact. The pact was sealed, but when their hands parted, a new fear took hold. Her lessons with Damien began not with spreadsheets, but with silence. He would sit across from her, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and simply watch. She felt like an insect under a microscope, every flicker of doubt magnified. After an hour, he finally spoke, his voice low and cutting. Your posture is a question mark, he said. You sit as if you're waiting for permission to be in the room. Eleanor stiffened. Your hands betray you. Confident people use their hands to speak, not to hide. He took a slow sip. When you are afraid, you look down and make yourself smaller. From now on, you will do the opposite. You will lift your chin. You will meet the Gainchies. You will occupy your space. He taught her that Julian's world was not about numbers, but about who told the most convincing story. Power was perception. Damien's plan was not to attack the walls of the Croft Empire, but to poison its narrative from within. He gave her books on military strategy and psychology. He made her watch depositions, forcing her to pinpoint the exact moment of dominance. It was never about shouting. It was about a pause, a well-timed question, a look of absolute certainty. Eleanor absorbed everything. But every night she would see a fraud in her reflection. A heartbroken woman playing dress-up. She would force herself to lift her chin, staring back until the fear was replaced by a cold resolve. 2 weeks later, he announced they were going out. He provided the dress himself, a simple sheath of dark gray silk. It was beautiful but severe, like armor. He drove to the service entrance of a historic hotel. A man in a dark suit led them through a heavy door into a hidden library. The air smelled of old paper, cigar smoke, and whiskey. In the center, under a low green lamp, was a large poker table. The men seated there were sharks. Eleanor's breath caught. She recognized a ruthless developer and a man rumored to have ties to organized crime. Damien pulled out an empty chair for her. Eleanor's playing tonight, he announced. His voice silenced any objection. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, firm pressure, then stepped back into the shadows to watch. A man slid a staggering amount of chips in front of her. Her heart was a frantic drum. She wanted to run. She found Damien's eyes in the dim light. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a command. Lift your chin, occupy the space. She took a deep breath and picked up her first hand of cards, her fingers trembling. For the first hour, she played cautiously, folding most hands, just watching. She remembered Damien's lessons. Watch their hands when they bet. Watch their eyes when they lose. Slowly, the fear sharpened into intense focus. She noticed the developer, Thomas, tapped his ring finger when he was bluffing. The shipping magnate, Marcus, had a slight tick in his jaw with a strong hand. She started winning small pots. The table's perception of her shifted. She was no longer a guest. She was a player. Then came the hand. She was dealt a pair of queens. The betting was aggressive until it was just her and a man named Petrov. He was the one with the dangerous reputation, his face an unreadable mask. He stared at her, his eyes like chips of ice, and pushed a mountain of chips into the center. The room fell silent. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The urge to fold was a physical force, telling her to retreat. But then she saw it. As he pushed his chips forward, the corner of his mouth twitched once. It was a flicker of triumph. Too much. It was a performance. Damien's voice echoed in her mind. Confidence is a decision. She looked at her cards, then directly into Petrov's cold eyes. I'll see your bet, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, and I'll raise you. She pushed all her remaining chips into the pot. The silence was absolute. Petrov's mask finally cracked. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He stared, searching her for a tell. Eleanor kept her expression blank, her chin up. After an eternity, Petrov cursed in a language she didn't know and threw his cards face down. He folded. The dealer pushed the mountain of chips toward her. An electric thrill, potent and dizzying, shot through her. It was pure power. When the game ended an hour later, she had nearly tripled her starting stake. In the bar, the city lights sliding past, Damien finally spoke. You saw his tell, but you waited 5 seconds too long to act. You let fear argue with your instinct. Next time, there will be no argument. You will simply act. His criticism was sharp, a demand for perfection. Eleanor just nodded, the adrenaline draining away, leaving exhaustion and something hard and new. They returned to the dark penthouse. They worked late, spreading Croft Industries' financial reports across the large desk. The papers represented Julian's life, and they were going to tear it all down. She leaned closer as Damien pointed out a discrepancy. Here, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. The money is hidden in inflated shipping costs, paid to a shell corporation. As he spoke, the back of his hand brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and undeniable, shot up her arm. Her breath hitched. The numbers on the page dissolved into a blur. All she could feel was the lingering warmth. She pulled her hand back as her eyes flew to his. He was already looking at her. His gaze was not cold or analytical. It was dark, intense, holding something she couldn't name. The space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with revenge. Her heart, so steady at the poker table, was now a wild thing in her chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He was the one who broke the spell. He drew his hand back slowly and walked to the window, turning his back to her. The moment was over. When he turned back, his composure was perfectly restored. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. He walked to the opposite side of the table. He picked up a slim manila folder and slid it across the polished surface. It stopped directly in front of her. That was practice, he said, his voice clipped and precise. This is the first move. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were contracts, emails, and technical specifications. Croft Industries is about to announce a partnership with a tech firm called OmniGen, Damien explained. The deal hinges on a new data security software they claim to have developed. He paused. The software is a fraud. It's a hollow shell built on stolen code. It doesn't work. Eleanor stared at the proof of Julian's deception. This was it. The first real step. The consequences would be devastating. She looked up at Damien, a silent question in her eyes. His expression was grim. OmniGen's CEO is greedy. He wants to believe Julian's story, Damien said. Your job is to make him and everyone else see the truth. The document Damien had given her felt heavy in her hands, though it was just a few sheets of paper. It detailed the precarious financial state of Marcus Thorne, Julian's key partner in a massive upcoming real estate development. The deal was meant to be the crowning achievement of Julian's career so far, a project that would elevate Croft Industries to a new level. But according to Damien's information, Thorne Global was a house of cards, propped up by secret, high-interest loans from questionable sources. The lie was so deeply buried, it would take a precise and anonymous strike to expose it. For 2 days, Eleanor did nothing. The papers sat on her coffee table, a silent challenge. She walked past them, her stomach churning. Part of her, the old Eleanor, was terrified. This was not just getting even. This was an act of deliberate destruction. It was cold and calculated. It was a language she was only just beginning to learn. She remembered Damien's quiet confidence, his calm assertion that the world she knew was built on such deceptions. He had not told her what to do, only given her the weapon. The choice to use it was hers alone. On the third day, she woke up before dawn. The sky outside her window was a dark, bruised purple. She didn't turn on the lights. In the dim glow of the street lamps, she put on a simple dark coat, pulled her auburn hair back into a tight bun, and put on a pair of glasses she didn't need. She looked like a different person in the hallway mirror. Anonymous. She left her phone at home, taking only a small amount of cash in the single folded piece of paper containing the core of the information. She took the subway to a part of the city she rarely visited, a neighborhood of old brick buildings and quiet, empty streets. She found a small public library that was just opening its doors. The air inside smelled of old paper and floor polish. A few students were scattered among the tables, lost in their books. No one paid her any attention. She felt like a ghost, invisible. Her heart was a steady, heavy drum against her ribs. This was not the frantic pounding of anxiety she had felt at the wedding. This was adrenaline, sharp and clear. She sat at a public computer in a secluded corner, the plastic of the keyboard cool beneath her fingertips. With methodical slowness, she created a new email account. The name was generic, forgettable. Then, she composed the message. She addressed it to a well-known financial journalist, a man with a reputation for breaking stories about corporate misconduct. Her words were simple and direct, stripped of all emotion. She presented the information as a concerned employee of Thorn Global, worried about the company's exposure. She attached a scanned document showing the flow of funds from an offshore lender known for its predatory practices. Her finger hovered over the mouse for a long moment. She thought of Julian's smug smile at the wedding. She thought of Sophia wearing her grandmother's ring, twisting it on her finger as if it had always belonged to her. The memory was no longer a hot, searing pain. It was cold, hard, and it gave her strength. She clicked send. The email vanished into the digital ether. She logged out, cleared the history, and walked out of the library without a backward glance. The morning sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the buildings. She felt a strange emptiness, a quiet hum where her fear used to be. The next 48 hours were an exercise in controlled patience. Eleanor forced herself to maintain a routine. She went to the gym. She bought groceries. She read a book she couldn't focus on. But beneath the surface of normalcy, she was coiled like a spring. Every few hours, she would check the major financial news sites, her screen glowing in her dark apartment. Nothing. The silence was deafening. She started to wonder if it had been a mistake, if the journalist had dismissed her tip as a crank email. The old feelings of doubt and inadequacy began to creep back in. That evening, her phone rang. It was Damien, her breath caught in her throat. He had not contacted her since she had left his penthouse. She answered, her voice deliberately calm. "Hello?" "Eleanor." His deep voice was smooth, unhurried. "I trust you're well." He didn't ask about the email. He didn't mention Julian or Croft Industries. Instead, he started talking about a new art exhibit that had opened downtown, discussing the artist's use of light and shadow. It was a test. He was gauging her composure, listening for any tremor of panic in her voice. She played along, her mind racing. She offered her own thoughts on the artist's previous work, her voice even and measured. She could feel his quiet approval through the line. They were two strategists speaking in code. "Patience is not simply the ability to wait," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "It is the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting." The line went quiet for a beat. She understood. "I've always found that the most difficult things are the most rewarding," she replied softly. A low chuckle came from his end of the line. "Indeed. Good night, Eleanor." He hung up. She lowered the phone, her hand steady. He knew she had done it, and he was telling her to hold the line. The first crack appeared the following afternoon. It wasn't a headline on a major network. It was a short post on a niche financial blog, the one run by the very journalist she had contacted. The title was cautious. "Questions arise over Thorn Global's liquidity ahead of Croft merger." The article was speculative, citing an anonymous source. It didn't accuse, it only asked questions. But the questions were sharp enough to draw blood. Within an hour, Thorn Global's stock began to slide. It was a small dip at first, only a few points, but the tremor had begun. Eleanor watched it happen in real time on her laptop. The red downward arrow was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The feeling that rose in her was not joy. It was a cold, satisfying surge of control. She had set this in motion. With a few keystrokes in a dusty library, she had shaken the foundations of a multi-million-dollar deal. By the next morning, the whisper had become a roar. Other news outlets picked up the story, amplifying the blog's questions. Analysts began to publicly doubt the wisdom of the Croft-Thorn partnership. Marcus Thorn released a furious statement denying the baseless rumors, But his anger only made him look more guilty. The market was spooked. The narrative was no longer in his or Julian's control. It was hers. The final blow came late that afternoon. A formal press release was issued. Due to unexpected market volatility and a need to reassess long-term strategic alignments, Thorne Global was officially withdrawing from the partnership with Croft Industries. The deal was dead. Croft Industries' stock immediately plummeted, wiping out tens of millions of dollars in value in a single afternoon. Eleanor read the news over and over again. She felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, of standing on the edge of a great height. She had done this. She, Eleanor Vance, the woman Julian had called dull and discarded, had brought a titan to his knees. Later that evening, a new kind of alert popped up on her screen. It was from a celebrity gossip site. The headline read, "Trouble in Paradise? Newlyweds Julian Croft and Sophia Hayes intense public spat." Below it was a grainy photograph, clearly taken with a long-lens camera. It showed Julian and Sophia standing on a sidewalk outside an expensive restaurant. Sophia's face was a mask of fury, her mouth open in a silent shout. Julian had her by the arm, his grip tight, his own face dark with anger. The perfect, smiling couple from the wedding was gone. In their place were two people trapped in the wreckage she had created. Eleanor stared at the photo. She saw the panic in Julian's eyes. She saw the furious, thwarted ambition on Sophia's face. She remembered Sophia's triumphant expression at the wedding, the way she had flaunted the Vance sapphire ring. Now that triumph was curdled into ugly rage. Eleanor felt nothing, no pity, no lingering pain. It was like looking at a photograph of strangers. They had become small, insignificant. The power they once held over her was broken. A car was waiting for her downstairs. Damien's driver, a silent man named Thomas, opened the door for her without a word. The ride to the penthouse was quiet, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows. She felt a profound sense of calm settle over her. When she stepped out of the elevator and into Damien's apartment, he was standing by the vast floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering cityscape. A large screen on the wall was tuned to a financial news network. The anchor was gravely discussing the collapse of the Croft deal, calling it a major blow to Julian Croft's reputation. They mentioned the mysterious rumors that had started the landslide. Damien didn't turn around, but he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "A foundation of lies is no foundation at all. It only takes one small push to bring it all down." He turned then, his piercing gray eyes finding hers. He gestured to the screen. "Your work, I presume." Eleanor walked over to the bar and poured herself a small measure of whiskey, her movements sure and steady. She no longer felt like an intruder in this space. She felt like she belonged. She held the glass, the amber liquid catching the light. She looked from Damien to the screen, where Julian's corporate headshot was displayed next to the plunging red line of his company's stock. A slow, grim smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of happiness. It was a smile of awakening. The broken-hearted woman who had fled her own life in tears was gone, burned away in the fire of her betrayal. In her place was someone new, someone colder and stronger. A surge of pure, unadulterated power coursed through her veins, a feeling more intoxicating than any love she had ever known. She had taken her first piece, and the game had just begun. The satisfaction of her small victory was a fragile thing. For days, Eleanor savored the news of Julian's company stumbling, of the cracks already showing in his perfect marriage to Sophia. It was a dangerous feeling. She chose a small, unfamiliar cafe, seeking the anonymity of sunlight and the scent of roasted coffee. She wanted to feel like a person who was not actively plotting the downfall of a dynasty. Her fingers traced the rim of a warm porcelain cup, the chamomile tea a quiet counterpoint to the nervous energy humming just beneath her skin. A shadow fell over her book. She did not need to look up. The expensive cologne was unmistakable, a scent she now associated with lies and stale champagne. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. But the old Eleanor, the one who would have flinched and shattered, was gone. She was buried in the ashes of a wedding that should have been hers. Slowly, deliberately, she finished her paragraph before lifting her gaze. Julian stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tailored trousers. He was trying to look casual, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the faint, angry line between his brows. His charm, once a force of nature, now looked like a poorly fitting suit. He had lost weight, and dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. He pulled out the opposite chair without asking, its legs scraping loudly against the floor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trying for smoothness but landing on a raw, frayed edge. "Fancy meeting you here." She offered a small, placid smile. "Julian, I wouldn't call a coffee shop fancy." She took a sip of her tea, her hand perfectly steady. She felt his eyes on her, searching for a crack, a flicker of the broken woman he last saw. She would not give it to him. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to talk. I know you had something to do with the Henderson deal falling through." It was an accusation, hurled like a stone. He expected a denial, perhaps even tears. Eleanor simply raised an eyebrow. "The Henderson deal? I read something about that. A shame. It sounded like you were counting on it." Her tone was light, conversational. Inside, her pulse was a frantic drumbeat, but her face was a mask of serene indifference. Julian's face tightened. The veneer of civility was already cracking. "Don't play games with me, Eleanor. This isn't you. This little corporate espionage act. Who are you working with?" He glanced around the cafe, paranoia making him look almost comical. He could not imagine her doing this on her own. "Working with," she repeated, letting a note of genuine confusion color her voice. "Julian, you seem stressed. Perhaps you should try the chamomile. It's very soothing." That was the wrong thing to say. A flash of pure fury crossed his face. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "I am not in the mood for your jokes. You think you can sabotage my family's business and get away with it? You have no idea what you're messing with." This was the pivot point. She did not shrink away from his anger. Instead, she leaned forward, mirroring his posture and closing the distance between them. The air crackled. She held his gaze, and for the first time, she saw not the man she had loved, but a spoiled, frightened boy. "My turn to talk," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the cafe's low hum like a shard of ice. "You seem to be under the impression that you can still intimidate me. You come in here, disrupt my morning, and make these clumsy threats. It's really quite disappointing." He stared at her, genuinely stunned into silence. This was not in his script. She continued, her voice low and steady. "The man I was engaged to was charismatic. He was subtle. He knew how to wield power without announcing it. You," she said, her eyes flicking over him with cold assessment, "have become loud, obvious, desperate." He finally found his voice, sputtering. "Desperate? I'm not the one who was left crying at the altar." The jab was meant to wound her, and for a second, a ghost of that pain whispered through her. But the pain was no longer her master. It was fuel. Eleanor smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "That's true, I did cry, and I am grateful for every single tear." She leaned back in her chair, a picture of relaxation. "Because they washed away the delusion that I was in love with a powerful man. I was in love with a boy who inherited a powerful name. There is a very big difference." Julian's face went from red to a pale, waxy white. He looked as if she had physically struck him. The words had not just insulted him, they had dismantled his entire identity with a few quiet sentences. "You should be more worried about Sophia," Eleanor added casually, her tone shifting again. She picked up her book as if the conversation was over. "I hear she's not handling the pressure well. A lifestyle built on someone else's money is precarious, isn't it? When the money starts to look uncertain, so does the loyalty." She did not look at him, just flipped to her bookmark page. That was the final blow. He stood so abruptly his chair nearly toppled over. "You will regret this, Eleanor," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage and something that looked a lot like fear. Eleanor finally looked up, her expression one of mild boredom. "I doubt it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I was at a very interesting part of my chapter." He stood there a moment longer, a spectacle of impotent fury as other patrons openly stared. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, the little bell above the door ringing furiously in his wake. Only then did Eleanor notice her hands were trembling. She folded them in her lap, taking a long, slow breath. The sunlight felt warm on her skin. She had faced him, and she had not broken. She had not even bent. A slow, genuine smile of pure triumph spread across her face. Across the street, parked in shadow, Damien Costello had watched the entire exchange from his sedan. He had seen Julian approach, a predator moving on what he thought was wounded prey. Damien's hand had rested on the door handle, his men waiting for a signal that never came. He watched Eleanor's posture, her deliberate calm, the way she mirrored Julian's aggression and turned it back on him. He could not hear her words, but he saw their effect. He saw arrogance crumble into shock, then into outright panic. He watched her dismiss Julian, turning back to her book as if swatting away a fly. A slow, dangerous smile touched Damien's lips. It was a look of profound satisfaction. He had given her tools, but the courage to wield them was all her own. He picked up his phone and sent a simple text. "Stand down. The situation is handled." He put the phone away, his eyes fixed on the cafe where Eleanor now sat in the sunlight, looking more powerful than he had ever seen her. He started the car and pulled away, melting back into the city's traffic. Julian fumbled for his car keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit them into the lock. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his Porsche, slamming the door. The space felt suffocating. He rested his forehead against the cold leather of the steering wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was not just the money, it was her. The look in her eyes, the gentle, accommodating woman he knew was gone. In her place was a cold stranger who looked at him with something worse than hatred. She looked at him with pity. He felt a wave of pure panic. This was not petty revenge. This was organized, intelligent, and ruthless. He grabbed his phone, his thumb swiping frantically across the screen. He scrolled past Sophia's name without a second thought. He needed real power. He needed his father. He found the contact and pressed call, his heart hammering his ribs. The phone rang twice before a gruff, impatient voice answered. "What is it, Julian? I'm in a meeting." "Dad," Julian said, his own voice sounding weak and thin. "Dad, we have a problem, a serious problem." There was an irritated sigh on the other end of the line. "If this is about the Henderson deal, I'm already handling it. Stop panicking." "No, it's not just the deal," Julian insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "It's Eleanor. I just saw her. I confronted her." "And?" his father asked, the disinterest clear in his tone. "What did the girl have to say for herself?" Julian swallowed hard, the memory of her cold, dismissive smile flashing in his mind. "Dad, you don't understand," he said, the words tumbling out. "She's not the woman I once knew. She's changed. She's dangerous. I think she's the one behind all of this, and I do not think she's working alone. We have a serious problem." The cold night air bit at Eleanor's skin, a sharp contrast to the lingering heat of her anger. She stood on the penthouse balcony, her hands wrapped tight around the cool metal railing. Below, the city was a sprawling galaxy of light, each pinpoint a life, a story, completely unaware of hers. Yet she felt like she was at the center of the world, a queen surveying a kingdom she was about to conquer. The meeting with Julian had played over and over in her mind. His shock, his sputtering rage, the beautiful, unfamiliar strength that had filled her voice. She had won that round. She had seen the fear in his eyes, and it was as intoxicating as any victory she could have imagined. But the triumph was hollowed out by a familiar ache. Seeing him, hearing his voice, had scraped open the wound she thought was beginning to scar over. It was the ghost of the man she once loved, a man who never really existed. The condescending smirk, the easy assumption that she was still the same fragile girl he had discarded. It reminded her of why she was doing this. The power she felt was real, but so was the pain that fueled it. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She tightened her grip on the railing, her knuckles turning white. She would not let that weakness show, not even to herself. The soft slide of the glass door behind her made her jump. She didn't need to turn to know it was Damien. His presence had a weight, a stillness that altered the very air around him. He came to stand beside her, not too close, respecting the invisible boundaries she had drawn around herself. He too looked out at the city, his hands in the pockets of his dark trousers. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant wail of a siren and the whisper of the wind whipping around the skyscraper. You left him speechless, Damien said finally. His voice was low, a calm rumble against the night. It was not a question. I watched from across the street. It was an impressive performance. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't a performance. No, he agreed softly. It wasn't. That's what made it so effective. He paused, his gaze still on the cityscape. And yet, you're out here, looking like you lost the fight. Her jaw tightened. I'm not. I'm savoring the victory. The lie felt brittle in her mouth. She felt his gaze shift from the city to her profile. She could feel the intensity of his stare as if he were cataloging every flicker of doubt in her expression. Are you? He asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you just saw a ghost. Eleanor finally turned to face him. The dim light from the penthouse cast long shadows across his face, making his features look like they were carved from stone. Maybe I did, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The ghost of a man I thought I knew. The ghost of the woman I used to be. She let out a sharp, humorless breath. It's ugly, seeing him. It reminds me of how foolish I was. Damien's expression didn't change, but something in his gray eyes softened. There is no shame in having been deceived, Eleanor. The shame belongs entirely to the deceiver. He was so confident, she continued, the words tumbling out now. So certain that he could still push me around, threaten me into my little box. He and his father. They think because they have money and a name that has been on buildings for 100 years, they are untouchable. They think the rules don't apply to them. A strange, cold stillness came over Damien. It was a subtle shift, but Eleanor felt it instantly. The warmth that had briefly entered his eyes vanished, replaced by a hard, polished emptiness that was far more frightening than any anger. Men like that, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Men who wear respectability like a suit of armor while they rot from the inside. I know them well. He turned back toward the city, his posture rigid. Eleanor felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She had only ever seen this man in complete control, a master of strategy and quiet command. Now, for the first time, she saw a crack in the perfect facade. She saw a flicker of a wound far older and deeper than her own. You speak as if from experience, she said cautiously. He was silent for so long she thought he would ignore the question. The city lights reflected in his unblinking eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. It was the voice of a man recalling a memory he had tried to bury for a very long time. My name wasn't always Costello, he began, the statement hanging in the air between them. That name I built myself, the one I was born with. I buried it a long time ago, along with the man who gave it to me. Eleanor held her breath. This was a place she never expected him to take her, the inner sanctum of his past. My father was a good man, Damien said, his tone measured, clinical. A builder, not a tycoon like a Croft, but he was honest. He built things with his hands, houses, schools. He had a partner, a man our family had known for years, a respectable man. He went to the right clubs, knew the right people, and had a smile that could charm a snake. He paused, and Eleanor could almost picture the man. She saw Julian's father. She saw Julian. My father trusted him completely. They were building a large community project together. Everything my father had was invested in it. His money, his reputation, his future, and his partner saw an opportunity, not to build something, but to take something. Damien's hand clenched into a fist in his pocket. He used the law. Complicated contracts my father didn't fully understand. He created false debt, cooked the books, and framed my father for mismanagement. It was all perfectly legal on the surface, perfectly vicious underneath. He bled our company dry, then pushed my father out, taking everything. The respectable man declared bankruptcy for the joint company, but he had already moved all the assets to a new corporation under a different name. He walked away a wealthier man. We walked away with nothing. The word nothing landed with a dead weight. Eleanor thought of her own humiliation at the wedding, the loss of her future. It was a pale shadow compared to the utter devastation she heard in Damien's voice. It wasn't just the money, he continued, his voice now a low, chilling monotone. That was the least of it. It was the shame. My father was a proud man. The whispers in town, the friends who suddenly crossed the street to avoid him. The bank took our house. I remember the day we left. My mother trying not to cry, packing our lives into cardboard boxes. My father just stood in the empty living room, staring at the walls he had built with his own hands. He was a ghost after that. The man who had been so full of life was just gone. The respectable man who destroyed him. He was celebrated in the papers a week later for his generous donation to a city charity. A single hot tear escaped Eleanor's eye and traced a path down her cold cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. She was crying not for herself, but for the boy Damien must have been, watching his world crumble. He destroyed my family, Damien said, the finality in his voice like a slammed door. Not with a weapon, but with a pen and a smile. He taught me a valuable lesson that day, that the most dangerous men in this city are not the ones who carry guns in dark alleys. They are the ones who sit on corporate boards and use the system to grind good people into dust. They are the ones who believe their wealth makes them gods. He fell silent. The confession was over. The air on the balcony felt heavy, charged with the weight of his past and its terrible echo in her present. She finally understood. This wasn't just a strategic alliance for him. It wasn't just about disrupting a rival's world. When he looked at Julian and his father, he saw the man who had torn his own life apart. Her quest for revenge was a reflection of a battle he had been fighting his entire life. Eleanor stepped closer to him. She didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt laughably inadequate. Instead, she just stood there, a silent witness to his pain, letting him know he was not alone with the memory. Slowly, Damien turned his head to look at her. The hard emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen before. He saw the tear on her cheek. His expression softened with a deep, aching tenderness. He raised his hand, his movements deliberate, hesitant. For a second, Eleanor thought he might pull away, retreating back behind his walls of control. But he didn't. His fingers, surprisingly warm against her cold skin, gently brushed the tear from her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a feather-light touch that sent a shudder through her entire body. The gesture was impossibly gentle, impossibly intimate. He then carefully tucked a stray strand of auburn hair, whipped loose by the wind, behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a moment by her temple, a silent comfort that spoke more than any words could. In that moment, everything shifted. The space between them crackled with an energy that was neither about revenge nor strategy. It was about two broken people finding the matching edges of their shattered pieces. His touch was not a claim of ownership or a prelude to a kiss. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. "I see you. I understand." Eleanor's heart, which had been pounding with a nervous rhythm, settled into a slow, heavy beat. The constant hum of anxiety in her veins went quiet. She looked up into his piercing gray eyes and saw not a fearsome underworld boss, but a man who understood the precise shape of her hurt because he carried his own. She realized her quest for revenge was now completely intertwined with Damien's own past. This was no longer just her fight, it was theirs. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The crushing weight of her loneliness, the feeling of being a single, small person against the world, began to lift. Without thinking, without planning, she leaned into his touch. It was a small movement, a slight tilt of her head, pressing her cheek just a fraction more into the warmth of his hand. It was an act of surrender, not to him, but to the profound, unspoken bond that had just been forged between them in the cold night air, high above the sleeping city. She was no longer alone. The connection they shared on the balcony was a fragile bridge, built in the quiet space between revenge and something more. Eleanor had leaned into Damien's touch, not as a victim seeking comfort, but as an equal acknowledging a shared wound. In that moment, the fight was no longer just hers. It was theirs. Now, the final piece of their strategy rested on the tip of her index finger. The penthouse was silent, save for the soft hum of the city far below and the frantic beating of her own heart. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated her face, casting long shadows against the dark wood of Damien's study. Beside her, Damien stood watching the city lights, his hands in his pockets. He was a statue of calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. He hadn't spoken for nearly an hour, giving her the space she needed. The files were all there, compiled into a single, encrypted package. Decades of deception, of cookbooks, of secret offshore accounts and fraudulent reports. It was the entire rotten foundation of the Croft empire, a legacy of greed built on lies. It was the weapon Damien had helped her forge. All she had to do was fire it. Her finger trembled slightly as it hovered over the mouse. This was it, the point of no return. Every step she had taken since that disastrous wedding had led to this single click. She thought of Julian's smug face, of Sophia wearing her grandmother's ring. The memory was no longer a hot stab of pain. It was cold, hard fuel. She looked over at Damien's reflection in the dark window. His gray eyes met hers, and he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the encouragement she needed. She took a steadying breath, the scent of old books and his whiskey filling her lungs, and she clicked send. The file uploaded in seconds. It was gone. Sent to a secure, anonymous drop for a federal investigator Damien knew was hungry for a high-profile case, a man who couldn't be bought. For a moment, nothing happened. The city didn't stop. The world didn't change. But Eleanor felt a profound shift inside her, as if a great weight had been both lifted and settled at the same time. She closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the stillness. "It's done," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Damien turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Now we wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The next day passed in a haze of tension. They didn't speak of it. Instead, Damien made them breakfast, his movements precise and calm. They sat on the penthouse terrace, the cool morning air a balm on Eleanor's frayed nerves. She watched the flow of traffic on the streets below, each car a tiny vessel carrying on with an ordinary day, oblivious to the earthquake about to shatter the city's elite. She kept checking her phone, but there was nothing, just silence. "They are being careful," Damien said, sensing her anxiety. He gestured to the board of a chess game they had left unfinished days ago. "They're verifying the source, confirming the data. A move like this isn't made rashly." He moved a black knight, placing her king in check. "It must be precise, devastating." Eleanor looked at the board, then back at him. "And if they don't believe it? If they think it's a fabrication?" "They won't," he answered with absolute certainty. "The evidence is irrefutable. Your knowledge of their internal structures made it perfect. It has the ring of truth because it is the truth." She spent the afternoon in his library, pulling a book from the shelf but reading the same page over and over. Her mind was elsewhere, picturing the chaos that was about to unfold. She felt a tremor of her old self, a flicker of fear for the sheer scale of destruction she was about to cause. But then she remembered the laughter in the ballroom, the casual cruelty in Julian's speech. She remembered Sophia's triumphant smile. The fear hardened once more into resolve. This wasn't destruction. It was justice, a balancing of the scales. The news broke at 4:15 in the afternoon. It wasn't a subtle leak or a quiet rumor. It was a thunderclap. Damien turned on the large screen in the living area, and the image that filled it made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. The imposing glass tower of Croft Industries was surrounded. News vans and police cars clogged the street. Federal agents, their jackets emblazoned with bold yellow letters, were swarming the entrance. The camera zoomed in on the revolving doors, which had been frozen mid-turn. A reporter spoke breathlessly, her voice filled with excitement. "We are coming to you live from downtown, where a massive raid is currently underway at the headquarters of Croft Industries. Sources are confirming this is part of a sweeping federal investigation into allegations of systemic corporate fraud." Eleanor sank onto the leather sofa, her eyes glued to the screen. It was real. It was happening. She watched as employees streamed out of the building, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. The camera then cut to a live feed from a helicopter, showing agents on the executive floor. It was a scene of controlled chaos. "Assets have been frozen," the reporter continued. "All accounts linked to the Croft family and their primary holding companies are now under federal control pending the outcome of this investigation." Damien sat beside her, placing a heavy crystal tumbler of water into her hand. Her fingers were cold. "Drink," he said softly. His presence was a solid anchor in the swirling vortex of the moment. She took a sip, the cool liquid a shock to her system. Then they saw him, Julian's father, Thomas Croft, the patriarch, the man who had always looked down on Eleanor with polite disdain. He was being escorted out of the building, not by his usual security detail, but by two grim-faced agents. His tailored suit was rumpled. His silver hair, usually so perfectly coiffed, was a mess. His face was ashen, a mask of disbelief and fury. He tried to hide his face from the cameras, but it was too late. The image of his humiliation was being broadcast across the country. Eleanor felt a surge of something dark and powerful. It wasn't joy. It was a grim, satisfying finality. The invincible man looked so small, so utterly defeated. She thought of the story Damien had told her, of the respectable man who had destroyed his family. She glanced at him. His jaw was tight, his gray eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that was almost frightening. This was his ghost, too. This was a victory for them both. Julian was nowhere to be seen, but the reporter mentioned his name, speculating that he was also a person of interest. The empire had not just been shaken, it had been decapitated. Its lifeblood, the money, was gone. The phone rang an hour later. Eleanor's phone. She looked at the screen, and her blood ran cold. The name flashing on it was Sophia. For a moment, she was frozen. 1,000 memories, 1,000 shared secrets, and laughter from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else flooded her mind. She could almost hear Sophia's bright, bubbly voice. Damien watched her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to answer that." Eleanor looked from the phone to his eyes. He was right. She didn't have to. She could let it ring. She could block the number and never hear from her again. But she needed to. She needed to hear it. This was the final act. She pressed the green icon and put the phone to her ear, her hand perfectly steady. "Eleanor?" The voice was unrecognizable. It was thin, ragged, and choked with panic. All the polished confidence had been stripped away, leaving only raw terror. "Ellie, thank God you answered." Eleanor said nothing. She let the silence stretch, forcing Sophia to speak into the void. "Did you see the news?" Sophia's voice cracked. "They took everything. They arrested Thomas. The accounts are frozen. We have nothing. Julian he's falling apart." Still, Eleanor remained silent. She pictured Sophia in her perfect mansion, the walls probably feeling like they were closing in, the designer clothes suddenly feeling like a costume. "Listen to me," Sophia sobbed, her words tumbling over each other. "This was never me. It was Julian. It was his father. They pushed me into this. I never wanted to hurt you, I swear. You know me, Ellie. You know my heart. He manipulated me. He promised me everything, and I was weak." The lies were so familiar. The blame shifting, the desperate attempt to paint herself as a victim. A year ago, those words might have broken Eleanor's heart all over again. Now they were just pathetic. She felt a ghost of a sting, the faint echo of a friendship she had once treasured. But it was like touching a scar. The feeling was numb. The wound had closed. "We were like sisters," Sophia pleaded, her voice rising in hysteria. "You have to help me. I don't know who else to call. You're the only one who might understand. Please, Ellie, for everything we were." Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked out the window at the city, her city now. She thought of the woman who had cried on the floor of the Grand Astoria ballroom. Her world shattered. That woman was gone. "Sophia," Eleanor said, and her own voice surprised her. It was calm. It was cold. It was the voice of a stranger. "You made your choice a long time ago. You chose the man. You chose the money. And you chose to wear my grandmother's ring to your wedding." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Now you get to live with that choice. All of it." A strangled gasp came from the other end of the line. "Eleanor, no, please. Do not ever call me again," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with ice. Then she hung up. The click of the phone disconnecting was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a final door slamming shut, locking away her past for good. She placed the phone face down on the table. A single tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or even pity. It was a tear of release, the final expulsion of a poison she had carried for far too long. Damien reached over, not to wipe the tear away, but to gently place his hand over hers on the table. His touch was warm, solid, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of her action. He understood what it had cost her and what it had won her. "It's over," he said, his voice low and deep. She turned her hand over, her fingers lacing with his. "No," she replied, looking at him, her eyes clear and resolute. "It's just the beginning." Later that evening, the news cycle was still dominated by the fall of the House of Croft. They ran archival footage of the family at galas, smiling for cameras, the picture of wealth and power. It was all juxtaposed with the current images of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the corporate headquarters. The story had everything: money, power, betrayal. It was a modern tragedy for the city's upper crust. A new piece of footage caught Eleanor's eye. A lone paparazzo had caught a shot outside the Croft mansion in the suburbs. The gates were closed, but a side door opened. A figure emerged, struggling with two large suitcases. The camera zoomed in, the image grainy but unmistakable. It was Sophia. Her hair was a mess, her face pale and swollen from crying. She wore no makeup. She looked lost and completely alone. She dragged her suitcases down the long driveway toward the main road, as if waiting for a taxi that would never come. The reporter's voiceover was clinical. Sophia Hayes, wife of Julian Croft, was seen leaving the family's estate earlier this evening. Her destination is unknown. But Eleanor wasn't listening to the reporter. She was looking at Sophia's hands, specifically her left hand, which was gripping the handle of a suitcase. It was bare. The Vance sapphire ring, the symbol of everything Sophia had stolen, the gaudy prize of her betrayal, was conspicuously absent. It was probably the first thing she sold. Or perhaps, in his rage and despair, Julian had taken it from her. It didn't matter. The symbol was gone. Her stolen life, her stolen status, had vanished. All she was left with were two suitcases and a long walk down a lonely road. The humiliation she had inflicted on Eleanor in a ballroom full of laughing strangers was now hers to bear, alone in the harsh glare of the public eye. The headlines were a relentless drumbeat of ruin. Croft Industries seized, accounts frozen. Julian's father, a man who once commanded boardrooms with a single glare, was now a grainy photograph on the evening news. Julian watched it all from a dim, smoke-filled bar on the city's forgotten edge. The television was muted, but the images screamed. He saw Sophia, her face a mask of panicked disbelief, dragging suitcases from the life he had promised her. The Vance sapphire, his grandmother's ring, was gone from her hand. It was the only detail that brought a bitter, hollow smile to his lips. She had taken everything else. He was adrift. His credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. His calls to former friends and associates went unanswered. The world he had owned, the city that had once been his playground, had slammed its doors in his face. In the lonely silence between sips of cheap whiskey, a name began to surface from the wreckage. A name he had heard whispered in connection to Eleanor. A name he had arrogantly dismissed. Damien Costello. It was impossible, a ghost story for the lower classes. But as he pieced together the timeline, the cold, efficient destruction of his family, the puzzle took on a terrifying shape. Eleanor wasn't capable of this, not the Eleanor he knew. But a woman backed by the city's most feared man certainly was. Rage, pure and undiluted, burned through the fog of his despair. It wasn't fair. He was Julian Croft. People like him didn't lose. He had been cheated, undermined by some back-alley criminal and the woman he had discarded. The thought was intolerable. He still had some cash, a few $1,000s he'd kept in a safe, emergency money he never thought he'd need. It felt pathetic, but it was enough. In his broken logic, there was only one solution left. He would not be erased. He would fight back the only way he knew how, by paying someone else to do it for him. He found them in a place that smelled of stale beer and desperation. Two men with blank eyes and the quiet stillness of those who solve problems with their hands. Julian, still wearing a designer suit that was now wrinkled and out of place, laid the cash on the sticky table. He explained what he wanted, his voice trying to reclaim its old authority. He wanted Damien Costello taught a lesson. He wanted to see fear in the man's eyes. The two thugs looked at the money, then at each other. They didn't know the name Costello, and that was all Julian needed. They were ignorant, hungry, and disposable. Perfect. They waited for 2 nights. They sat in a rented sedan across from a sleek black glass restaurant that Damien owned. Julian's nerves were frayed. He was fueled by adrenaline and the last vestiges of his pride. This was it, the moment he took back control. He imagined Damien stumbling out, caught off guard. He pictured the man's perfect suit getting torn, his calm expression breaking. It was a pathetic fantasy, but it was all he had left. He needed to see Damien bleed, just a little. He needed to prove the man was not untouchable. Just after 11 o'clock, the restaurant's heavy doors opened. Damien stepped out, not alone. Eleanor was on his arm. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, and she moved with a confidence that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. This was not the woman he had humiliated at his wedding. This was someone else entirely. She was laughing at something Damien had said, her head tilted back, her eyes sparkling under the city lights. The sight of them together, so easy, so powerful, was like a physical blow. It was worse than any financial ruin. "Now," Julian hissed, his voice cracking. "Go now." The two thugs got out of the car, pulling their jackets tight to hide their intentions. They were big men, and they moved with a clumsy, predatory gait. They started across the street, their target clear. Julian watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. From the corner of his eye, he saw Damien's hand rest gently on the small of Eleanor's back. He said something to her, his voice too low to hear. She nodded, her expression unchanged, and stepped back toward the restaurant door, as if he'd simply asked her to wait a moment. Damien didn't even turn to fully face the approaching men. A shadow detached from the wall of the building next door. Another seemed to materialize from the driver's seat of Damien's parked car. There was no shouting, no dramatic standoff. There was only a brief, brutally efficient flurry of motion, a blur of dark suits. The first thug was spun around, his arms pinned behind him before he could even raise his hands. The second man took 2 steps before he was simply swept off his feet, landing on the pavement with a soft, final thud. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Silence returned to the street, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. The 2 thugs were on the ground, groaning, their brief rebellion extinguished. Julian sat frozen in his car, his mind unable to process the sheer speed of it. His hired muscle, his last desperate gambit, had been neutralized without Damien even breaking a sweat. One of Damien's men opened the passenger door of the sedan and looked at Julian. There was no anger in his eyes, just a flat, dismissive emptiness. "Mr. Costello would like a word," he said, his voice calm. It wasn't a request. Julian's legs felt like they were made of lead as he got out of the car. He was pulled, not roughly, but with an undeniable force, into the narrow alley beside the restaurant. The air was cold and smelled of damp cardboard. His 2 failed attackers were already gone, vanished as if they had never been there. At the end of the alley, leaning against the brick wall, stood Damien Costello. He was illuminated by a single, bare security light overhead, casting long shadows that made him look larger than life. He hadn't loosened his tie. His hair was perfectly in place. He looked like he had just been interrupted from a pleasant evening. Julian stopped a few feet away, trembling. All the rage, all the arrogant fury had evaporated. It was replaced by a primal, chilling fear. This was not a business rival. This was not a man you could sue or intimidate. He was looking at a different kind of power, something ancient and absolute. Damien pushed himself off the wall and took a slow step forward. He stopped just out of arm's reach. He didn't raise his voice. He barely seemed to be speaking above a whisper, yet every word echoed in the narrow space. "Julian Croft," he said, the name sounding like an epitaph. "You had everything, a name, a fortune, a woman who loved you, and you threw it all away because you were bored." Julian tried to speak, to defend himself, but his throat was tight with terror. You don't know anything," he managed to stammer. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed Damien's face. "I know everything," he corrected softly. "I know your father built his empire on bad faith and broken promises. I know you learned his arrogance, but none of his skill. You see people as stepping stones. You saw Eleanor as a beautiful, respectable accessory. And when you grew tired of her, you swapped her for a shinier model, humiliating her in the process." He took another step. Julian flinched, stumbling back against the cold, wet brick. You thought it was a game, Damien continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a hypnotic, terrifying murmur. You thought you were a king, but kings have responsibilities. You have none. You are just a spoiled child who broke his favorite toy and is now throwing a tantrum because it can't be fixed. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Did you really think you could touch me with these animals? You don't understand the world you've stumbled into, Julian. You are a tourist here, and your vacation is over. Julian was openly shaking now, tears of fear and humiliation welling in his eyes. What do you want? He whispered. There's no money left. You've taken it all. I don't want your money, Damien said, his gaze turning to ice. I never did. This was for Eleanor. She was the one who pulled the strings. She was the one who found the rot in your father's company. I simply gave her the tools to expose it. This is the world you created, Julian. She just showed it to everyone. Damien looked him up and down, a final dismissive assessment. You wanted to teach me a lesson, so I'm going to teach you one. It's the last one you'll ever learn. He didn't make a threat of violence. It was something far worse. From this moment on, you are a ghost. Every door you thought was open to you is now locked. Every person you once called a friend will now cross the street to avoid you. Your name, the name you were so proud of, is now synonymous with failure and disgrace. You will not find work. You will not find help. You will find nothing. You will walk through this city, the city your family helped build, and no one will see you. You wanted to erase Eleanor. Instead, you have erased yourself. Damien held his gaze for a long final moment, letting the weight of the curse settle. Julian could feel it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. It was not a physical attack, but a complete and total annihilation of his identity. He was being unwritten from the story of his own life. Without another word, Damien turned and walked out of the alley, his footsteps echoing and then fading into silence. He did not look back. Julian slid down the brick wall until he was sitting on the grimy, wet pavement. He was left alone with the smell of garbage and the chilling finality of Damien's promise. He reached into his pocket, his hands searching for a phone that was no longer connected, for a wallet full of cards that were worthless. He found only lint. He looked at his hands, pale and trembling under the harsh security light. These were the hands of a man who once held the world. Now they held nothing. Julian was left broken and penniless in an alley, stripped of his power, his reputation, and his future. The Founders Gala. 1 year ago, Eleanor walked through these doors on Julian's arm, a sapphire on her finger and a future promised. Tonight, she returned to bury a ghost. The memory of that night in this very ballroom was now acid. She smoothed her midnight dark gown. Her only jewelry was a pair of diamond studs from Damien, cold and brilliant. He stood beside her, a shadow of power in a perfectly tailored black suit. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of both support and ownership, and did not ask if she was ready. The doors swung open, a wave of polite laughter and music washed over them. Then, a ripple of silence spread from the entrance through the gilded room. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The string quartet seemed to hesitate. For a moment, the entire gala held its breath. Eleanor Vance, the woman so publicly broken, was back, and she was on the arm of Damien Costello. She kept her chin high, her gaze sweeping the room. She saw familiar faces, people who had offered her condescending pity months ago. Now, their expressions held shock and fear. One by one, they looked away, suddenly fascinated by their champagne flutes. They were not looking at a victim. They were looking at power. Damien guided her through the crowd, which parted for him without a word. His focus was entirely on her. He led her towards the glittering champagne tower, his hand a warm, steady anchor on her back. "A drink?" he murmured, his voice for her alone. She gave a small nod, her throat tight. A server in a crisp uniform approached, her hand trembling so much the champagne sloshed. Eleanor's gaze traveled from the shaking hand to a pale, drawn face she knew better than her own. It was Sophia. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her ambitious eyes now hollow and red-rimmed. Their gazes locked, and Eleanor saw it all. The panic, the shame, the plea for a past that was gone. Behind her, another caterer hurried forward. His shoulders slumped in defeat. It was Julian. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting jacket. The arrogant smile was replaced by slack-jawed exhaustion. He saw Eleanor, and his body went rigid. His gaze flickered from her to the formidable man at her side, and a flash of pure terror crossed his face. He finally understood who had orchestrated his ruin. A savage, triumphant pulse beat in Eleanor's throat. This victory was more complete than she had ever imagined. It was not just about their money or status. It was this perfect, devastating moment, seeing them here reduced to serving the very people they had desperately tried to impress. They were invisible. She held their gazes for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. She could have said 1,000 things. Instead, the new Eleanor, the one Damien helped forge, knew that true power was in restraint. She gave them a slow, polite, and utterly dismissive nod. It was the kind of acknowledgement one gives to a doorman. Then she turned her back on them. She took a glass of champagne from a different server and walked away, leaving them frozen in the wreckage of their lives. She did not look back. Damien led her to the polished dance floor as the string quartet began a slow, haunting waltz. He took her glass and then her hand, drawing her close. They began to move, gliding across the marble. The crowd around them blurred into a swirl of color and light. They danced without speaking. He had seen the confrontation, the finality in her small nod. He had given her the tools, but she had wielded them with a cold precision that was all her own. As the music swelled, he spun her gently. Then he drew her back, closer than before. Her head rested against his shoulder, and she closed her eyes. The ghosts were finally silent. The pain was a distant echo. The war was over, leaving a quiet peace where the fire of vengeance had been. Damien leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a low murmur that cut through everything. Revenge is complete. What now, Eleanor Vance? The music from the gala faded behind them, replaced by the soft hum of the car's engine. Neither Eleanor nor Damien spoke during the ride back to the penthouse. The city lights streamed past the window, a river of gold and white against the dark glass. Each light had once been a painful reminder. A reminder of dates with Julian, of laughter with Sophia, of a life that had turned out to be a lie. But tonight they looked different. They looked like possibilities. Damien's question echoed in the quiet space between them. What now, Eleanor Vance? It was not a challenge, it was an invitation. The final page of a long, painful chapter, waiting for her to write the first word of the next. Back in the penthouse, the silence was vast and deep. It was a comfortable quiet, a space they had built together over months of whispered strategies and shared glances. Eleanor slipped off her heels, the cool marble floor a relief against her tired feet. She walked to the immense floor-to-ceiling window, the same one where she had stood on her first night here, feeling broken and lost. The city spread out below her, a glittering, endless tapestry. It was no longer a monster that had chewed her up and spit her out. It was just a place, a map of streets and buildings holding a million different stories. And now one of them was hers to write. She felt Damien's presence behind her before she heard him. He didn't crowd her, simply stood a few feet away, giving her the space she needed. The faint scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and something uniquely him, wrapped around her. It was the scent of safety, of power, of home. For so long, her life had been defined by what was taken from her. Her fiancé, her friend, her reputation, her trust. She had spent months taking it all back, piece by painful piece. Revenge had been a fire that kept her warm in the coldest of nights. But fires eventually burn out. What was left in the ashes? She thought of Julian's hollowed-out expression at the gala, the desperation in Sophia's eyes. There was no triumph in seeing them, only a quiet, weary finality. They were ghosts from another life. Their power over her was gone, evaporated into nothing. The satisfaction she had expected was fleeting. It was not the real prize. The real prize was the woman she had become in the process. The woman who could stand in a room full of enemies and not flinch. The woman who could look the most feared man in the city in the eye and see an equal. Slowly, Eleanor turned from the window. Damien was watching her, his gray eyes holding an unreadable expression. He had seen her at her absolute worst, covered in tears and humiliation. He had guided her, taught her, and armed her. He had given her the tools to dismantle her past, and he had never once asked for anything that diminished her. He had asked only for her trust, her intelligence. He had wanted to see her win. Now the game was over. The scores were settled. His question hung in the air again, a silent, patient inquiry. What now? Her own voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. It held none of the trembling uncertainty of the woman who had first called his number. For months, all I thought about was tearing something down, she said, her gaze locked with his. The Croft Empire, Julian's pride, Sophia's false life. It was all about destruction. She took a step closer to him, the space between them shrinking, the energy crackling. I'm tired of tearing things down, Damien. A flicker of something warm moved in his eyes. He remained silent, letting her own the moment. Eleanor's lips curved into a small, confident smile. It was a real smile, not the grim, vengeful one she had worn while watching the news of Julian's downfall. This one reached her eyes. Don't bum. Now, she said, her voice dropping with purpose. We built something of our own. The words settled in the quiet room. It was not just an answer, it was a vow, a new pact, not one born of revenge, but one born of ambition and a shared vision. It was the future laid out in 7 simple words. For a long moment, Damien just looked at her. He saw not the fragile woman from the Astoria Hotel, but a queen who had finally claimed her throne. A throne not of inherited wealth or social status, but one she had forged herself out of fire and sheer will. Then he closed the distance between them in a single fluid motion. His hand came up, not to her face as it had once before on the balcony, but to the back of her neck. His fingers were warm against her skin, tangling gently in her hair. He didn't pull her. He simply held her, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below her ear. Her breath caught in her throat. This was different from every other touch they had shared. There was no strategy here, no unspoken negotiation. This was something else entirely. Raw, real. He lowered his head, his gaze never leaving hers. Something of our own, he repeated, his voice a low murmur. It was not a question. It was an agreement, a confirmation. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion fueled by a chase or a victory. It was a kiss of arrival. It tasted of expensive whiskey, of quiet strength, and of a promise for 1,000 tomorrows. It was the sealing of a bond that had been forged in the shadows and was now ready for the light. Eleanor's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. She melted into him, letting go of the last vestiges of the old Eleanor. The victim, the heartbroken fiancé, the scorned woman. They were all gone. In his arms, she was just Eleanor, and it was more than enough. When he finally pulled back, their foreheads rested against each other. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them. He didn't need to say a word. She could see it all in his eyes. The respect, the admiration, the deep possessive affection that went far beyond their alliance. This was where her journey had been leading it all along. Not just away from Julian, but toward Damien. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It felt natural, inevitable. He led her back to the vast window overlooking the sprawling city. Together they stood and watched the distant lights. The pain of her past was now just a story, a prologue to a much grander tale. The city was no longer a backdrop for her heartbreak. It was a kingdom waiting for its new rulers. It was a canvas, and they held the brushes. Damien squeezed her hand gently. She squeezed back, her heart full not with the fire of vengeance, but with the warm, steady glow of something far more powerful. Hope, love, a beginning. Hand in hand they stood before the vast cityscape, 2 powerful figures of their own making, their story just beginning. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.